Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and also to those attending online. Oh, sorry. Not me, okay. Okay, and to those who are attending online, thanks for joining us too. We have 3 speakers in this session. The first 2 will be presenting online, and then our third one will be in person. So first up, we have Wade Smit, and he's a PhD candidate at UCT, where he is investigating the conceptual history of umbuso in isiZulu literature. And the title of his paper is Eco-centric isiZulu nature poetry as resistance to climate change and environmental amnesia in 3 collections from 1963.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much to Amazwi Museum and the organizers of this event. I really am very excited about this, to be part of this. I think especially the interdisciplinary focus of the conference and the turn towards ecological questions, it is really important. And as someone who comes more from a literary background, historical background, it has been an exciting bit of a push and an opportunity to turn some of those historical methods towards ecological questions. So yeah, thank you so much for organizing this. The paper that I'm presenting today, it focuses on 3 collections of isiZulu poetry that were published in 1963. Amahlungu aluhlaza, which means green pastures. Izimpophoma zomphefumulo, which means the waterfalls of the soul. And imikhemezelo, which means soft rains. And these 3 collections, I'm looking at them together and not separately because they mark a very interesting moment in the history of Zulu literature as an intervention into not only the school's space, but into literary history really as a whole in the country. They were edited by Sibusiso Nyembezi, who was one of the most prolific Zulu authors in Zulu literary history. He was the author of 3 novels, which were Ubudoda Abukhulelwa, Mtanami Mtanami, and Inkinsele Yasemgungudlovu. He also translated Ellen Payton's Cry the Beloved Country into English, and wrote extensively for the schools market. He created a series of school readers called Igoda between 1962 and 1964. And his goal for these readers, and really all of his literature, was to transmit knowledge, sort of, indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, and knowledge about the past to new generations, because he was one of these writers of, you could sort of say that Kholwa literary tradition of African scholars and thinkers and writers who were influenced by missionary education and Pan-Africanist ideas that were beginning to form with the likes of Magema Fuze in the late 1800s. Early 1800s. Now, Sibusiso Nyembezi, his father was a Methodist minister, and most of the poets in these collections have this background in the Christian missionary space, went to missionary schools. And with Nyembezi himself, his father had to have different posts in these different towns, preaching in different towns, and some of them urban, some of them rural. And this reflects in Nyembezi's work, where he uses these novels and these works to depict the changes in life, from rural life to urban life, the sort of changing industry, comparing this relationship to nature that people already did possess pre-industrialization, and a more industrialized economy where these city centers and colonization is increasingly changing ways of life. Which makes his editing of these 3 poetry collections very interesting, because all three of them have a sort of eco-centric focus and situate themselves around themes of nature, beauty, history, spirituality, nationalism, identity, and power. And I think some of the scholars on Zulu poetic history talk about how these early Zulu poets were very influenced by European romanticism, and this is why they have this relationship to nature in their poems. But they do something a little bit different, where their depiction of the relationship to nature is very much tied in with the political history, the political changes that were happening at the time. And in this paper, I tried to use a methodology that's new to me and quite exciting. It's called eco-criticism, which was pioneered by Cheryl Glodfelty. And what it basically was created as by Glodfelty was this response to a literary field, I think in the 1970s or 1980s, somewhere around there, was this response to a literary field that wasn't catching up to the increasing need to talk about ecological crisis. And the idea is to focus the analysis of literature onto combining it with environmentalism and ecological study to really see how did these texts relate to nature, which is an interdisciplinary approach, and it requires making some links that aren't always that obvious in a single discipline. So looking at these poems, I've tried to historicize them in terms of the moment that they were written. Sometimes when the poems draw on memory, I try to look at when were these memories possibly formed by the poets, and just look at them in the historical context of the country. So one of the main themes that they have is this idea of nature being an unknowable entity. This reverence for nature, this idea that humanity is in some sense small and is a small part of nature, really. And this kind of conflicts with the growing trends of industrialization and apartheid, the racist apartheid economy, which sought to use scientific knowledge to increase the efficiency of the exploitation of nature. And I think this idea is best represented in Creswell Sipho-Mkhize's poem in one of these collections called Amandla Angabonwa, which translates to the unseen power. And it's interesting how in this poem, he doesn't specify what that power is, and it's unknowability. He doesn't talk about it being a god or a creator or ancestors or gravity or, it's an unnamed, unknowable power that moves all things. And I'll just read briefly the first stanza to give an indication, of what he's talking about. I'll first read in Zulu and then I'll read the English. He says, "Ngiyawesaba amandla angabonwa, amandla aphumisa ilanga nenyanga, aqhakazise izinkanyezi phezu komhlaba, avunulise izwe ehlobo liqhakaze, aphinde alihlubulise alikhothe umbala, angenzela isithebe ngayintuthane kuso, angenze ngayimi ngazazi ngawabona, aphephethe imikhumbi emikhulu yaminza, amisa amadwala aphinde awasibhekele, aphephethe umhlaba ube licheke, athi esakhile aphinde adibize, athi edibizile aphinde akhe." So this, what he's saying is, I fear the unseen power, the power that brings out the sun and moon, that blooms the stars above the earth, that decorates the land in summer so that it flowers, that then uncovers it and takes away its color, that made a plate of food for me, I an ant on it, that made me who I am and know myself. I saw it blow the great ships that they drowned, that stopped great boulders and then placed them upon us, that blew clean the earth and made it a field, that having built then destroys, and having destroyed then builds. And this idea of the unseen power, this power that can mean so many things, that moves through all things, it's seen in all the poems in these collections that deal with nature, that nature is not something to be toyed with. Sorry, this is a fly. It's not something to be toyed with. It's not something to be abused, that it can very easily wipe us out. It's something to be respected, to be feared, and also to be grateful for. It helps us, can also hurt us, and in that way isn't an easily understood thing. this idea of the unknowability of nature, it's quite subversive to the idea of industrialization and colonialism that wanted to grasp control of all things. You see that also in poems about stars that sort of represent this idea of craving a relationship to nature. Like a poem called Izinkanyezi Ningabe Niyini. So stars, what are you? And the poet, just a brief excerpt, says, Emthonjeni xasika ebusuku sinibona khona emanzini kakhulu nithanda ukuntanta sondelani phela nize nani lapha sikhona. This is in the spring where we gather water at night. We see you there. In the water, much do you all enjoy to float. Come closer, ye all, so that you can be here where we are. So, I mean, there's this idea of a relationship to an abstract idea of nature. That there's just these stars, these lights that you stargaze at while looking down towards water, while you're gathering water. The sustenance idea that pre-industrialization, it's a thing to revere. This ability to draw water and sustenance and resources from nature. And nowadays, because of the pollution of industry, the idea of harvesting water from a river is a sign of poverty, inequality, disease, etc. But this poem also says, come, want these stars to be closer. You want to have this relationship to them. But there's also a yearning, because the poem continues and says, mhlawumbe nifuna thina size kini izinkanyezi sizonibonela eduze uba niyini kodwa ningabe nje niyini izinkanyezi nalapho nihlala khona ngabe kunjani. The poem says, perhaps stars, you wish for us to come to you so that we see you up close for what you are. But really, what are you, stars? And there where you reside, what is it like? And this idea of reciprocity is not just a demand that nature comes to us and does what we please, but that also we have to approach nature and think of it on its own terms. And I just really am fascinated by the idea of questioning. Where are stars? It's this idea of you imagining this unseen, unknowable power. There's another similar poem also called Izinkanyezi, which is about stars. That questions the forces that hold stars together and really wonders what is this force of space. The poem goes on, kodwa nimiphi izinkanyezi nibanjwe yini lapha emoyeni sinibuka size sinkeme kuze kufayize lamehlo kube buhlungu nezintamo siqolozele njengabantwana sinibuka imvunulo yezulu ake nisitshele nimiphi. And it means, but where do you stand, stars? By what force are you held there in the air? We look upon you until we are lost in wonder, until our eyes are blurry and our necks are sore, having stared like children upon you all, the decoration of the heavens. Why don't you tell us where you are? Again, there's this sense of scale, human scale. The sense of respect that humans are small in the scale of nature and that we can't know everything, that to know everything is in some sense disrespectful. Other poems talk about a childhood where children could go out for themselves in freedom and gather wild fruits. And when you historicize this, you can see the poet in question, Antonin Nzimande, was born in 1917. So between 1917 or 1920 and 1935, the period of what would have been his childhood, you can really see that would have been the period in which he had this relationship to nature. Freedom, nature provides, but this changes by the sort of by the 60s. And I think this is where I really get into, just to start to close off, this is where we really get into why these collections are interesting, that they were published in 1963. This is 3 years after the Sharpeville massacre, 3 years after the Colebrook mining disaster, in which at least 435 lives were lost. In the tumult of the 1960s, where mining and industry are, and the apartheid government are destroying Black lives every day, and the landscape, the actual physical landscape is changing every day. Why is it that these three collections seem so utopian and seem so peaceful? And I think it's interesting that these poets would have chosen to write like this. And in some ways, I think in their position as Kholwa educated people, they would have been more exposed than the average person to the changes in knowledge systems, the changes in economy and industry, and been very aware that, you know, our relationship to the earth is changing. And there's a usefulness in recording as poems, as an archive, how they remember their relationship to nature being, and to actually name types of wild fruits, to name types of trees, to have this reverence for nature. It was Sibusiso Nyambezi's aim that collections like this in the schools would teach a new generation of people the knowledge of the past, even in such a changing world. And I think this is what I mean by, in the title, climate activism. It's resistance to climate change, it's resistance to environmental amnesia, because to have environmental amnesia, just briefly, is the idea that every day the environment changes. You know, the environmental crisis that we're in, it's such a gradual change that we can talk about it and sometimes don't remember how our relationship to nature was very different in the past. And these kinds of poems record a way of life, a relationship to nature that was different, so vastly different, that it shows us what was and what could be in the future. It also shows us how to relate to nature differently. And I think that's what's quite interesting about them as a source of knowledge about the environment, capturing a moment of very drastic social, political, spiritual, economic change. It was all wrapped up in together. I think I've passed my time, so I will maybe just end off on a few lines of a poem that talk about the Colebrook mining disaster, and then I'm done. And it talks about how the Colebrook mining disaster was really a tragedy that was based upon the structure of migrant labor. The poem starts and says, Kwafam Swazi, Kwafam Zulu, Kwafam Sotho Colebrook. And it ends by saying Kwafam Xhosa, Kwafam Pondo, Kwafam Lungu Colebrook. And it talks about how many different types of people died. The middle of the poem says, Beza bejabule, bezo zamimpilo, bashiya makhaya, bashiya isihlobo, zakhala izinsimbi, zavuka izinsizwa, zehla zaya phansi, ziyolwa nedwala. Which means they came happy, coming to try a new life, having left their ancestral homes, having left their relatives. The bells rang, the men woke up, they descended, went down to war with rock. And it really ended in tragedy. It was not a war they could win. And this poem signifies the promise of industry, the economic promise of apartheid that ultimately was violence. The miners that were stuck, that saw the disaster coming, who tried to escape, were threatened with arrest for desertion. And I think, as a closing comment, I'm going a little bit over time. The reason why looking at poetry collections like this is so important, and why Amazwi's focus on language is so important, is because these are sort of ignored archives, ignored repositories of knowledge systems that were intended for us to read today and reinterpret. So the interdisciplinary idea of looking through the eco-criticism lens, it really shows how rich of an archive these kinds of poems can be and how relevant they are for combating climate and environmental amnesia and climate change today. Thank you so much. I'll end there.
Much, Wade, for bringing the music of that isiZulu poetry to us. Yeah, it's fascinating. Next up, we have Tamara Guhrs, who will be presenting online, I believe. And she is a writer, theatre maker, and independent researcher. And she'll be telling us about elephants. Her title of her paper is Where Elephants Tread, Using Theatre to Re-Story Human-Elephant Relationships.
Hi, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you, Wade, for your beautiful little glimpse into that sense of being dwarfed by nature, which I think in some ways will be the topic of reflecting on elephants and our human relationships with elephants as well. I'd like to start, before I share my presentation with you, just by reading a brief introduction, and then I will go into it visually with you as well. So this paper is a reflection on the work I've been doing on and off over 20 years with a local community-based theatre group called Zakaza, based in the Luangwa Valley, Zambia. It's an urgent call for the use of story and performance in relationship building and conflict resolution between people, wild elephants, and other large game in protected areas, where conservation projects may have been heavily reliant on militarized anti-poaching operations, or where mistrust has crept in between different stakeholders over the treatment of human-wildlife conflict, particularly in relationship to crop damage. So it's a call for really rethinking our social, mythological, and cultural entanglements with elephants in areas where people share space with these charismatic animals. And I'm going to just share with you I'm hoping that you can see my screen. So I focus specifically on the Luangwa Valley, and I'm not sure if I'm getting slide control here. Just a second, there we go. Sorry, let me just do this. Okay. So the Luangwa Valley is where I've been local for most of my life. And I've had the privilege of witnessing how different narratives concerning human-elephant relationships have shifted over the last 4 or 5 decades. Luangwa Valley is affectionately known as the Valley of the Elephants, and it's the oldest part of the Great Rift Valley and is the largest undammed river system in Africa. It's home to large concentrations of game. It's a seasonal oxbow ecology, bracketed by escarpments to the east and west, and it's traditionally been home to the Kunda people, who are subsistence farmers and hunters. I grew up in this valley in a coexistence with elephants that has been marked by equal amounts of fear, fondness, respect, and dependence. Dependence because without them we wouldn't have been there at all. A debt of gratitude that I ironically owe to the colonial predilection for slaughter. Photographic tourism, now an industry in this area, has in its lineage walking safaris established by my grandfather, which were intended to reproduce the experiences of walking through vast tracts of bush for days on end, camping under the stars with nothing but a mosquito net for shelter at night, a small entourage of porters, and an armed game guard or fundi to intercept encounters with big game. So you might detect from the language that I'm using in this last paragraph that these stories were passed on to me or absorbed by me with a fair amount of romanticism. And these are tropes that are typical of colonial game ranger narratives, as beautifully critiqued by Dan Wiley in his book Death and Compassion, The Elephant in Southern African Literature. I won't be dwelling too much on that aspect of narrative shifting in this paper, but just to say that the fact that my grandfather was there at all was because he had been appointed in the 1940s as an elephant control officer. And he was employed specifically to keep marauding elephants from destroying people's crops by killing them. So, of course, we respond to this now with a certain measure of horror, as he did in the later part of his life, which he dedicated to the conservation of elephants. We love elephants, right? In the popular imagination, they are to be treasured, preserved, and protected. They're seemingly so similar to us in emotional capacity, in social and family kinship bonds. We call them gentle giants. But of course, people who share space with elephants know that they are not to be trifled with, can be unpredictable, and of course can kill you very quickly. It's not morally self-evident to all that elephants must be protected at all costs. Neither is it clear-cut to adopt the sustainable use position, which says that wildlife must pay for itself. On the borders of protected areas, humans and elephants are increasingly in conflict. So what is the nature of this conflict? Elephants are migratory. They follow well-known routes that their ancestors used. And of course, people also settle in areas which elephants like to use. And this creates tension and increases the likelihood of dangerous elephants. So it's difficult to ask people to be considerate and tolerant towards elephants when their livelihoods in the forms of crops are regularly decimated, or if the incidents have escalated to the point where elephants have become so stressed that their behavior is unpredictable, aggressive, and can lead to fatalities. So there is this vicious cycle of escalation of tension. In the Luangwa Valley, there's been a progression over time, just very, very briefly, in the 1940s and 50s when the game reserve was established and game control officers would shoot marauding elephants. There was an overpopulation, again in inverted commas, an overpopulation of elephants, which led to cropping and culling. And there's a long set of discussions which can be had around population control, but I don't really have time for that now. Then in the 1980s and 90s, there was heavy poaching, which led to a different kind of narrative around militarized policing of poachers and to increase the kind of tension and escalation between wildlife authorities and local people. In the 2000s and in the last sort of 20 years, there's been more of a shift towards community-based conservation. And I would like to just share some of the initiatives that are used in the Luangwa, because I believe that there is a difference in the Luangwan policies and the way that elephant control is conducted compared to places like Livingstone, which, although more densely populated by humans, has had far more incidents of elephant conflict. So some of these measures include things like electric fences, and I think you can see by the look on this woman's face that she's a little skeptical that this is going to keep out an elephant. And then the use of planting chilies around as buffers around crops to keep out elephants, because they don't like chilies. Other crops that are distasteful to them are ginger and lemongrass and things like that. And then the chili blasting is where they create a pellet of chili oil, which is shot at the elephant, and then they feel a sting and they brush it away with their trunk, and there's an unpleasant, it's very sensitive to them. And so that is an effective deterrent, or supposedly an effective deterrent. And these are scouts waiting for elephants or posing for a picture. These are some of the alternative solutions which have also developed into livelihoods, so that the chilies and other products can be used as a deterrent, as an alternative way of bringing in income for households. And then theatre. So I would love to introduce you to Seka, who have been 20 years practicing a community-based popular theatre way of dealing with the issues that present at a local level. And I will just share a couple of little moments. So Seka means sensitization through Kunda arts, sensitization and education through Kunda arts. It also means to laugh. They have a very vibrant physical theatre comedic style. They deal with issues using deep ethnographic research and consultation and discussion. So it's very much an active problem-solving kind of theatre. And just to briefly touch on what theatre can do in these situations. So first of all, it brings an element of empathy and spirituality, so building commonality to present stories in which we share the idea that just like us, elephants have families to feed, just like us, elephants can experience trauma, to link to historical and mythological cultural beliefs that connect us on deeper levels to elephants. There's also an element of research and decision making. So I'm just checking that I'm okay for time. Decision making. So theatre can be a way of really garnering community perception and coming to a deeper understanding of community beliefs, and then presenting those up to power. So rather than a top-down educational message-based type of theatre, there is also this capacity for theatre to speak back to power. And finally, this idea of conflict resolution that comes from the strong tradition of popular theatre and theatre for development in Zambia, where different perspectives are presented, and when people see their own perspectives presented alongside the enemy's perspective, then there is more likely to be fruitful conflict resolution type of discussion. And finally, I wanted to just pose, okay, so this is Zakaza's method. They live in the community, develop stories based on deep research and ethnographic deep hanging out. They develop a problem-posing play, which usually includes humor. And then in the performance always comes with discussion and community action planning with key stakeholders as part of that process. And I'd love to end with just posing a sort of a question to say that up until this point, that theatre, the type of theatre that Zaka has done has always been aimed at local audiences and international audiences. They do perform for local lodges to try and build deeper understanding of the, I suppose, the historical indigenous attitudes and beliefs around human-wildlife relationships. They do practical demonstrations of how to make chili pepper bombs, how to plant buffer zones, and all the other conservation South Luangwa initiatives which are in place, as well as how to build elephant-proof grain bins. My question, though, is it time for us to present theatre for elephants with an audience of elephants? Because in some ways already the approaches, all of these, this combination of approaches with sensory interventions, sound, smell, and I guess food, in places like Livingstone, where elephants need to be perhaps redirected onto other routes, other migration corridors. Would it be possible with a theatre making attitude and approach to use all of these elements and tools to be directed towards perhaps communicating to elephants a message that we would like to share with them? And I leave you with the question of whether this is whimsy or fruitful research. And I'm going to stop sharing. And I think my time must be up.
Thanks very much, Tamara. Yeah, really interesting about the elephants and a theatre for the elephants. I like that idea. Next up, we have Nompucuko, Hluma, Zakaza, And her paper is titled Amazwi, oomakhulu, IsiXhosa Folktales as Viable Stimuli for Environmental Education in Rural Eastern Cape Classrooms. So we look forward to you.
Enina nikumbeleni, enina nikumbele, enina nikumbeleni, enina nikumbele, enina, 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 enina nikumbeleni. This is asking you, why are you so angry? Thank you very much. Before I say anything, please surprise the food in your stomachs from the lunch with a short video before I start the presentation.
Wathi ke kaloku ngantsomi kwakukho inkosikazi eyayingafumani bantwana, iyinkosikazi yenkosi. Inkosi inamakhosikazi amaninzi wayefumana abantwana. Suka le nkosikazi yazibhaqa ililolo. Isuke inkosi yayeka nokuya endlini yayo kuba kaloku le nkosikazi ayifumani bantwana. Oh, yayibuhlungu intliziyo yayo. Imani ihamba yodwa, iyokuhlakula, iyokutheza, amanye amakhosikazi ehamba engamaqela, eteketisa abantwana bawo, kumnandi. Kuthe kunjalo, yahamba isiya emasimini, ihamba yodwa ililolo, yafika khona, yahlala, ukugqiba kwayo ukuhlakula, inenhliziyo ebuhlungu, iphumla. Kuthe kunjalo, kwathi gqi intaka. Oh, yabuza ukuba, ulilela ntoni nenkosikazi entle kangaka? Oh, yaxela ingxaki yayo. Kuthe kunjalo, yathi intaka, yabuya ngokukhawuleza, yathi kuyo, Ina, uze uginye apha la matye mabini ngokukhawuleza.
Uyalila umntana kasihamba ngenyanga, uyalila umntana kasihamba ngenyanga.
Yayimangalisiwe, heyi, ingaqinisekanga injalo, yathi intaka, uyabona ke, ukubekhe wathi bimbilili la matye mabini uza kubafumana abantwana. Okunene ke yakholelwa inkosikazi, yathi, ndizawumenzela ntoni xa sendibafumene abantwana? Yathi ke intaka, hayi, akho nto mawusenzela yona, nawe siphe awethu amatye amabini. Inkosikazi nayo yathatha amatye amabini. Hayi ke intaka yathatha ke amatye yemka. Okunene ufikile inkosikazi ekhaya wenza njengesiqhelo. Ekugqibeleni ke inkosi yaye yeva ukuba inkosikazi yayo ifumene ntoni? Umntwana omhle. Yavuya inkosi ukuba kanti uhleliwe nje inomntana omhle kangaka, yacela uxolo. Okunene yathi inkosikazi, igama lalo mntwana masithi ngusihamba ngenyanga, angaze aphume endlini. Ndizawuqinisekisa uba abantu bonke bayazi ukuba ukususela ngoku lo mntwana akaphumi endlini. Amanzi uwakha kakuhlwile. Uyalila umntana kasihamba ngenyanga, makalile njalo, ndithunywa amanzi emini, thandalaza nje, ndicela uba ndiwakhe, thandalaza nje, ndiwakha kakuhlwile, thandalaza nje. Gqibeleni ke umakoti wayemane emncancisa kumntana wakhe xa impelesi ifike naye, kodwa abantu belali baye bambhaqa ukuba uyancanca umntana emlanjeni.
umntana kasihamba ngenyanga. Uyalila umntana kasihamba ngenyanga. Makalile njalo. Makalile njalo.
Yho, abantu benza inkohlakalo yokulandela befuna ukuyowulanda umakoti bamrhintyela ngentambo, bagibisela intambo emanzini, bamrhuqa besiza naye ekhaya. Yho, alandela amanzi nawo, alandela abheke ekhaya. Yho, baqonda ukuba basengxakini, mabacele uxolo, bahamba bamphindisela emlanjeni, bacela uxolo ukuba ethunywe amanzi emini, kodwa bekuthiwe uwakha xa kuhlwile. Okunene baqonda ukuba bonile ukususa loo mini kwabakho uxolo phakathi komlambo kunye nendawo abantu ababehlala kuyo. Phela ngantsomi.
Uyalila umntana kasihamba ngenyanga. Uyalila umntana kasihamba ngenyanga. Makalile njalo. Makalile njalo. Dithunywa amanzi emini qandala.
Thank you very much. Our grandmothers, the voices, happen to be the voices who from the time in history oozed wisdom of folktales, which they passed down from generation to generation with great pride. Many of these folktales carried not only the names of the ogres, the rivers, the animals, the birds, but a very deep language that fostered fundamental environmental education lessons. However, the voices are nowadays less regarded as means to pass that knowledge and skill to their elite grandchildren who grow up to suffer this label of being called the lost generation. Ironically, there are ample tools to digitize these voices for meaningful consumption by its own. I emphasize by its own, because most of the time we find that what is digitized is not consumed by the very same grandmother who has been recorded to make sure that story remains. With this presentation, I seek to demonstrate how Amazwi oomakhulu as storytellers are important for environmental education, to also create opportunity for children to appreciate and enjoy Amazwi oomakhulu. You might be surprised that I'm also a grandmother. I might look 16, but the reason you see me demonstrating there is because I am the grandmother. So I am demonstrating meaningfully and from a background of understanding how it feels when you are a grandmother and you find yourself being put at the back of everything else that is happening in terms of technological developments, whereas you can still be exploited as a resource. I also want to make sure that to encourage teaching and learning using the readily available folktales by teachers and parents. When I say readily available, I mean in each one of us, in your chest, somewhere there, folktales are readily available. They are part and parcel of your home. You don't need anything. They are already there. Some are archived far, far away from us. They are readily available. Yet, they are not exploited. I also want to make sure that we persuade society and curriculum designers to take cognizance of the role of IsiXhosa in Tsomi folktales as viable stimuli for environmental education in the rural Eastern Cape classrooms. That gentleman standing there is hired to press these buttons when I talk, because I'm very passionate about this subject. I'm sure when you are looking there, each slide comes up. I'm using my phone to present. This is what you might say academically is the actual problem that I am experiencing and I see happening, that adults, society, and curriculum designers do not emphasize the role and the value of the grandmother's voice as narrators of IsiXhosa. And so children, they will continue to disregard them if that is the case. And they will continue to not understand why they exist in this environment. And it will create less opportunity for them to excel in their education. As Ngugi wa Thiong'o once mentioned, a way of life fashioned by a people in their collective endeavor to live and come to terms with their total environment is what is in us. So I want to make sure that the voices for environmental education are voices for action. These are the simple steps I took to demonstrate this to you. I simply read Professor A.C. Jordan's English version of Usahamba Ngenyanga folktale, shortened it, re-narrated it, so that it is something else. And while I was doing that, I recalled my grandmother's voice when she was narrating the story to me as a young girl. And with friends who are technologically correct, as you have seen from the digitized work, we combined this footage to take photographic images of the video of our local natural environment and juxtapose it with the new story. So that there is this footage to make sure that there is continuity for environmental education lessons in local rural classroom. You might wonder why I'm saying rural. It's because I'm from the village of Ngqolosa Tsomo, and rural matters to me because children don't understand their own language and they don't understand English as the language of teaching. Going backwards to the theoretical perspectives, we understand that we had not today's narrative about what is going on between Russia and Ukraine. The Tbili's report, 1977, those principles were telling us about the importance of environmental education, and later replaced by the NGO principles, which the United Nations emphasized that we, as agents of change, must run with the torch. So we are the tools, we are the resources as storytellers, so that there is action to actually bring out the competencies that are readily available to make sure that we deal and encourage with change. Also, various scholars, I quoted Mutasa here, because they used Shona folktales to show the very same thing, that grandmothers are vital, they can be used. They played a role, an important role in making sure that nature is preserved. Also, in Japan, it is also done. Why can't we do it with our IsiXhosa in Somiso? Environmental education, quoting from the Tbili's, should be a continuous lifelong process, beginning at the preschool level and continuing through all formal and non-formal stages. In addition, education is the right of all means including that grandmother seated there, who does not only visit the classroom only when there is a problem with something else, but meaningful visiting of the class. It was left to individuals. I stand here as an individual and representing the collective of grandmothers and NGOs. We have several NGOs who have been carrying the torch, as you have seen this morning in South Africa, to pick out the Tbilisi and run with it. You might notice in this slide that there's AC Jordan's face. His bones are shaking somewhere in America, in Madison, where he is buried. Sadly, the children of Mbogotwana in Solo, they don't know a thing or understand who is he, or where is he, or what happened to him. Probably no one even talks about him. He is somewhere archived in Cape Town, at the University of Cape Town, for us academics to use as we please. But we want to go back to Mbogotwana and make sure that the children in the classroom understand that they've got an icon buried in Madison. So all South Africans, present and future, must enjoy a decent quality of life and make sure that they go deeper. I coined that deeper. Where to? When I say deeper, I mean you go deeper, you look into yourself. The D stands for digitize. Yes, I agree, digitize. But encourage children to make sure that they have access to this content and expose the grandmothers to it. Don't just digitize and run away. And promote the value of indigenous storytelling in local classrooms as viable stimuli. Recall the past voices of our grandmothers and restore their dignity, and avail funding to advance the NGO cause for uplifting their own and creating meaningful environment awareness programs for sustainable development. My PhD, as Dr. Zakaza, resides in the shelves here at Rose University, Mazibuyele Ekhaya Intsomi zesiXhosa, which I passed in 2020. It's written in isiXhosa because I'm surely taking it back to the village. The villagers know what was said about them. So, actions speak louder than words. Grandmothers nurtured, voices preserved, stories retold and revived, storytellers recognized, more folktales for future, nature preserved, and posterity, a reality. I want to emphasize on this word posterity. As you might have seen that there was a picture of the two grand women. One of them, Nongenile Zenani, said that she's telling stories for posterity, which means if it's not a reality. Harold Shoib wrote so many books and mentioned this woman, and we need to make sure that posterity happens. Recently, I traveled with Dr. Masiko to Sutherland. We were doing indigenous storytelling for astronomy and environmental education. This is what she said: indigenous storytelling for astronomy and environmental education in its absolute sense. Some of our stories are written in the stars, others are written in the sand. That's what she said. It is this month, it is not a long time ago. Stories are at the memorial at the University of Madison. Over 3,000 Intsomis are there at Wisconsin, where Professor A.C. Jordan is buried. They are there at the library. They are archived there in the memorial. Where is the memorial for those Intsomis? So, we want to send a strong message that it is time that we begin to realize that we are a mind that is ready to make sure that the language of the environment, as you might have heard in that Intsomi, the pebbles, the stones, the rivers, the waters, the mountains, and everything still come out so beautifully from the stories that were told. There is no way that we can talk about integratedness in the classroom if we leave stories, Intsomi, folktales out, because our curriculum speaks of integrate the lessons, integrate the standards, all the jargon of the policy that is changed now and again means that we need to be mindful of the fact that it is already there It's something that needs to be unearthed, and people need to be shown. You can't tell me to do something if you don't show me how it is done, or prepare me, or make me aware how it speaks to the current curriculum or the classroom. So individuals and NGOs and universities should begin to walk their talk. You see that there is UNESCO there. I happen to be the commissioner for United Nations as chosen by Minister Angie Motshekga. Thank you that they enabled me as well to come to this workshop. Thank you, Amazwi. Because it means if they realize that there are ample opportunities for ordinary people out there to give them what is practical within United Nations from our villages, from our local context, then Africa and the global dialogue will change. I also happen to be a provincial coordinator for Nalibali. Here is the story. In the Eastern Cape, I see so many places, I visit so many museums, I visit so many people, and want to make sure that the voice of the story for children to run to the books is important. So you cannot say children must read books if they don't know how it sounds. So, as a provincial coordinator for Nalibali, thank you very much, Nalibali, for enabling me to stand here. You might see there is a logo that down there. My being Nompucuko Zakaza, Dr. Nompucuko Zakaza. I initiated Lisa Hluma skills development way long ago. Saying, in whatever we do, if it is not about the children, forget it ever happened. That is why I was so happy when I saw opportunity to present on the influence that our grandmothers can still have to bring about the vocabulary of nature preservation and serve the nation meaningfully for sustainable development. Enkosi, ndiyabulela.
Thank you, Nompucuko, for speaking on behalf of the grandmothers. We'll now take questions, if anybody has any questions for our three speakers, Wade, Smit, Tamara, and Nompucuko. Yes, at the back there.
Hello, this is for Wade. In his first poem, there was a line that he said, nature can destroy us. And I'm thinking about that in the context of COVID. And so there are many conspiracy theories I'm sure people will remember. So what are his thoughts about that? Can we say that one of the reasons we had COVID was nature turning against us?
Thank you so much for the question. That's a very interesting question. I think very early on, there was discussion about how pandemics like this are more likely to happen the worse climate change gets. The sort of close proximity to animals, livestock. I mean, pandemics and outbreaks have been happening for as long as we've had, not agriculture, but we've had domestic animals. And the hotter the earth gets, and the more animals suffer, and the more the environment suffers. Yeah, it is. I think what you're asking speaks to that reciprocal idea. The more we damage nature, the more volatile it gets, the more in turn we get damaged. I think that's pretty much would be my answer, that there's this reciprocity. What we do to nature will sort of end up doing it to ourselves. Yeah, thank you so much. That is a very interesting question.
Thank you. Any other questions? And if you are attending online, please post them in the question and answer section, apparently. Johan, yes, please, over here.
Hello, this is for Zakaza. You talked about the 3,000 folk tales in the library in Wisconsin. What would, in your unlimited imagination, what would you like to do with those 3,000 in Suomi?
COVID failed me. I wanted to go there, repatriate, meaningful repatriation of intangible property like stories. But unfortunately, 2020, I couldn't go to that library. Rhodes University tried to make me go there, but unfortunately, there were barriers, systemic barriers. So we would like people to understand that the University of Wisconsin-Madison has got its own stake in Sutherland. If they've got a stake in the viewing of the stars, why can't they have integrated meaningful environmental awareness by also making sure that the stories that are in the library at Wisconsin are integrated properly by being used? So I would like to see the stories being used in Willowvale, where the grandmothers came from. I have started doing that, working with the writers to say that they are available online. www.wisconsin, they are readily available. Read them, shorten the stories, and make sure that you go to Willowvale. There is a screen as big as this in the village. Access the community so that they can see the past, so that they can look forward to the future. If those insomies are not in the curriculum in the schools where I researched, who else is going to do it if the people whose hands are in the cookie jar understand that they can carry their big screens to that village so that children can relate to the past and know that they are reading about an ordinary person from this village, even if this was between 1967 and 1975. Nobody stops you. It's post-democracy. We are free. You are free to do it. Collaborate, and let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, over there, Jeannie.
Okay, all right, thank you, yes. This one's for Tamara. I'm fascinated by the idea of a theatre for elephants. Yes, I think the research is great. I just wanted to check with her, is it happening? Are you looking at what might constitute an enjoyable or viable or educational experience for the elephants?
I think part of doing this talk today is me taking a step in that direction to say that this idea, which has been kind of sitting with me in a very unformed way for a long time, it's the kind of thing that needs collaboration, it needs partners. I would love to partner with, well, funding is obviously always a thing, but also with, in an interdisciplinary way, with people who can really help to monitor and document the results of such a thing, so that it would be not just whimsy, but perhaps have some hard evidence behind it in some way. I have the environment and the space in which to do it. I have the idea, and I'm very, yeah, I think I would love to. So if you know of anybody who would come on that journey with me, please talk to me.
Thanks, Jeannie, for that. Yes, I see two over here. Oh.
I think mine will not be a question per se, but would be a comment, because I think that now all these presentations are leaning towards, you know, the creative part of literature, be it a performance or storytelling or whatever genre of creative that's, you know, there. But again, I studied creative writing, not knowing that, you know, much impact would be put in as far as the academia is concerned on the creative side of doing things. But now I'm learning more on how, you know, these could sort of be synchronized and be put together to do one kind of streamline of information dissemination. I do not know whether people understand what I'm saying, but I'm trying to say something about creative writing as part of, you know, academia or academics as well.
Yes, I'd agree with you. Bringing together the creative links, we've had a nice range of papers in this session, the poetry and the theatre and the storytelling. Yes, Nompucuko.
If it's narrated, it's easy for children to start writing creatively about it as well. So writing for real reasons is coming from telling stories that are meaningful. Reading for fun and real reasons also answers your question. My question to Wayne, you mentioned relevance of archives. I also happen to wear another cap of being the chairperson of the Provincial Archives and Records Committee in the Eastern Cape, and archives are a word that is still not understood. When you say relevance of archives, what exactly do you have in mind? Because we still have in Port Elizabeth, Lindinlewa might attest to that, archives that are seated elsewhere in a very bad state in Mthatha, in Port Elizabeth, everywhere. What do you have in mind where we have systemic barriers when it comes to archiving important history and heritage that might assist us seated in this room to make sure that we are contributing to sustainable development of our environment? Because I believe in those archives there is worth of material that is going to be destroyed if digitization, if other systems are not occurring as we wish. So I don't know whether you were talking in that context, but my mind just thought about that when you were talking about relevance. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I think when I talk about archive, I'm trying to think about archive on many different levels, and especially when it comes to poetry and conceptual history, I'm thinking about also language as an archive in itself. You know, so many of these poems talk about izindoni. They talk about umvutswamini. They name different trees, different fruits. A word like an umbuso that I'm studying, you really look into this word, it's like an archive in itself. It tells so much about history, about thought, about intellectual, you know, traditions. But these are intangible things. And I think that in archives across the country, there has to be such a familiarity with language, familiarity with our languages, in order to actually know how to deal with the depth of this material. How do we archive a word? You know, how do we archive a word that is an archive? How do we look into the archives and interact with them dynamically? You know, I think in terms of the digitization thing, it's so important. But I think also reproduction is important, because in areas where at the moment internet and digital tools are not available, I think digitization and physical reproduction is important. To actually send physical copies and little repositories everywhere gives people access where electricity can be a problem, internet can be a problem. Yeah, I think there must just be a dynamism. I'm not an archive expert. This is just my own personal feeling about it, is that archives can be and need to be very dynamic across digital, physical, and also about how we think about other intangible archives weaving together. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Wade. Yeah. Any other questions from the floor? Hard to see. I picked up quite an interesting common thread. You spoke about re-narrating, and then Tamara also mentioned restorying. So I was quite interested if you could speak a little bit more, Tamara, about restorying. What do you mean by that, really?
Hi, I was actually writing something in the chat right now about in Donna Haraway's book, Staying with the Trouble, how she speaks about the need to think we must think, we must rethink. And writing, in response to the comment about creative writing, writing is a form of thinking. And yes, I mean, I didn't really go into those stories in very much detail because of time, but I think the narratives that have been governed in a way, the way we relate to nature and the way we relate to elephants in this case, have really, you know, there's narratives around domination and control, there's narratives around protection, there's narratives around population control. And it's interesting how it's shifted from control of elephant population to control of human populations in some ways, that this so these are all, you know, quite contested sort of stories and narratives. And I think what theatre can do in many contexts, and literature and creative writing, is to, I suppose, by shifting the way we understand those stories and the way we tell those stories, there's a kind of a disrupting mechanism that can, or a disrupting force that can happen through the writing, through the stories, through the theatre. We shift the stories, we kind of maybe break the stories open, or yeah, and in doing so there's play on words that we're also then restoring in some way the connections that we once had.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Tamara. Marika says she has an online one.
Angelique Michaels asked Wade Smith, what you foregrounded and what I think is pivotal in this shift that ecological justice necessitates is this relationship with nature as one of reciprocity and a sense of mystery necessary for reverence and respect. You said, I'm paraphrasing, that to presume to know everything about something is in itself disrespectful, and this suggests understanding as implicated in relations of power, which is an important and valuable insight. I'd like to hear your thoughts on possible ways we could cultivate this appreciation and reverence for the mystery of nature as reflected in these poems, while deconstructing works like these and trying to understand indigenous relations to nature.
Hi, Angelique. Thank you so much for the question. It's a big question. That's a very big question. It's quite hard. My immediate response, I think, has got a lot to do with feeling. If you're trying to cultivate an appreciation and reverence for nature, I really think look straight back to Dr. Zakaza's presentation. I mean, in the story that she's presenting, the setting of the story, it's in this natural setting. It's showing a road. It's showing a human intervention into nature. She's talking about a bird, and when she spoke about the bird, she, you know, Dr. Zakaza, you revered this bird, you made its noises and stuff. So I think so much of it is about de-weaponizing the knowledge about nature in a capitalist, hyper-capitalist world now. The moment something is known, even if I conduct research, I conduct research about nature with a good intent, some corporation somewhere will say, how can I use this to make a profit? But someone like Dr. Zakaza, the knowledge about nature is something for beauty, for feeling, for staying in the moment, making a story, making a song. I love that scene when you were singing and there was that image of the river. I mean, I love rivers. And something about that, the river looked happy. The river looked really happy to be sung to. I think a lot of it is about changing how we think of knowledge about nature. Obviously, sometimes it's not just that we don't know things or that things are unknowable. Sometimes we do. with science and with traditional knowledge, human beings are smart, we're intelligent, you know, we find things out, but it's about what do we do with that knowledge. We might just want to sit with it and say, this informs how we can be more peaceful. And it really does come back to what do we do about industry, capitalism, etc. It's such a complicated question. But it's, yeah, thank you very much for putting it the way you did.
Thank you, Wade. Any other questions from online or the floor? Okay, well, I think thank you to all three of the speakers. And we had some interesting ideas there about singing to the stars and singing to the elephants and singing to the rivers as well, I think. So all three of them. Yeah, thank you.